Before Deputy Boyd Barrett, you leading off?
Yeah, I'm sharing time with Deputy Murphy. Minister, faced with an absolutely shameful housing and homelessness emergency, a crumbling health service which is inflicting such hardship and suffering on so many of those who need that health service, a climate emergency that is galloping towards us, a further education system that is in dire need of investment as our universities tumble in the world rankings, and in a society which is marked by some of the greatest levels of inequality and deprivation in the Western world, this budget is a complete non-event. It doesn't scratch the surface of the most serious and pressing social issues facing huge numbers of our citizens. And most disappointingly of all, it fails on the issue of housing. We have the shameful situation of 10,000 people living in emergency accommodation and 4,000 children whose childhoods are being stolen from them because of the failure of your policies. We have about 140,000 families, which adds up to about 500,000 people who are on housing lists at the moment with almost no hope of ever getting a council house. We've 70,000 families in serious mortgage distress, and we have a whole generation of young people who really at this moment have no prospect of ever being able to afford a home of their own or even being able to pay the extortionate rents that are out there in the private rental market. And faced with that emergency and following the enormous demonstration that happened last week, you would think that this government would have done something dramatic and radical to address that crisis and their own policy failures in the area of housing, but you've done nothing. Nothing. And I mean nothing. You can spin the figures as much as you like, but actually, if you just parse what the Minister said, he hasn't broken one iota from the failed Rebuilding Ireland plan. In the Rebuilding Ireland plan, for 2019, we are promised 9,540 new social housing units. Not even all of those are council housing. And do you know what the Minister said today? That figure, that dismal figure, is going to 10,000. So it's going to increase by 460, the target. But is the target even going to be met? The dismal target is going to increase by 460, but then you look at how you're doing on the 218 target and you discover that in all 4 Dublin County Councils in the first 6 months of this year, you've delivered a grand total of 203 council houses. 16 in Dublin. There's 20,000 families on the list in Dublin and you've delivered 16 houses in Dublin City. There's 40,000 people on the housing list in the 4 Dublin counties and you've delivered 203 council houses, which is not even close to your target, which in and of itself is a dismal target that won't even scratch the surface of a situation where we've 144,000 families on the housing list. It's pathetic. It's an insult to the people in emergency accommodation, to the children whose lives are being wrecked by the housing crisis. You have not acknowledged at all that Rebuilding Ireland is a failure. But what you have done is given an additional €121 million in HAP payments to private landlords who are creaming in the profits on the backs of the misery of those who are suffering from the housing crisis. And to add insult to injury, you then want to give them more tax relief on the monies they borrow to buy into the private rental sector, which is just shocking in the extreme. You're going to give them a tax break to either buy property to rent into this disastrous rental market or to refurbish, which, by the way, and nobody has said this, is going to incentivise the evictions that we have already seen by landlords exploiting the loopholes in the Residential Tenancies Act, because they will get tax breaks if they do the refurbishments, which then justify them evicting tenants. That has been one of the major reasons tenants are being evicted, is so-called substantial refurbishments, and now you are going to incentivise them to do that and provide them with the justification to evict more people. It's unbelievable. And I'm not sure if you were following the case out in Sandyford that I was involved in during the week, Minister, of how these loopholes are being exploited by the people you set up, Oireachtas, who you invited in, who are now the biggest corporate landlord, bought property at a song from NAMA, and this week attempted to exploit another loophole you left in the legislation to increase the rents of people in Sandyford and Beacon South Quarter by 25 to 35%, from an average rent of $2,200 up to $2,800. When I went up there and met those residents, I couldn't even believe they were paying $2,200. I was shocked at that. Who can afford $2,200? And Oireachtas was looking for it to go up to $2,800, and you have allowed a tax loophole that would allow that to happen. Now, because of the bad publicity, and because we jumped up and down here about it, the next day, and it shows you that people power works, Oireachtas phoned all those people and said, actually, we're going to withdraw the rent increases, but the loophole is still there. And now you're creating an incentive to exploit another one of the loopholes. It's unbelievable. It's shocking in the extreme that you're doing it. So your targets are dismal, and the additional money that you've allocated is pathetic compared to the problem, but it won't even deliver any substantial number of extra units next year faced with that crisis. So you're sticking to the Rebuilding Ireland plan, which has failed and failed disastrously. And that is a grim prospect, to be honest, Minister. That is a grim prospect for the people in homeless accommodation, and emergency accommodation, and the families waiting, in my area now, up to 20 years on the housing list. And you know, I mean, this year there was a slight increase in the amount of council housing in our area, but next year there's not even the planning in that could produce more than 8 units in Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown in the following year. So even these targets, which you never meet, which are dismal, will not actually be delivered. It really is grim. And then you have this affordable housing scheme. Again, it's an absolute joke. An absolute joke. Because of the 10 years that you stopped building, we need 35,000 housing units built a year to even deal with the demand for housing that's going to develop over the next number of years. 35,000 units, right? Yous are planning to build next year under Rebuilding Ireland, 6,000 directly, and then under this affordable scheme, 2,000, which actually won't be next year, but they'll be the year after. 2,000 affordable housing units against a demand for 35,000 plus the 6 or 7, right, is not even a third of the requirement. So you're relying on the private sector to deliver the rest, who A, we know are hoarding and speculating and not building in the numbers that are required, but in any event, what they are building is completely unaffordable. But even this miserable drop in the ocean of an affordable scheme of 2,000 units per year starting the year after next won't even be affordable in the areas where the housing crisis is most acute. Because a 40% discount on the market rate in areas like South Dublin or North Dublin, where property prices are now off the charts, mean that they will not be affordable. The affordable houses will not be affordable for people on lower and middle earnings and incomes. And that conundrum is also the reason why a lot of the public land, which we should be building on, why nothing is moving. Every single local authority in the Dublin area is bogged down at the moment in interminable arguments about how you get the balance between public, private, affordable, council. There's big rows going on, so nothing is moving, and insofar as anything is moving, your councillors in South Dublin, in Dún Laoghaire and elsewhere are actually arguing for the sale of public land. That's what you are doing. So all this spoof about public and affordable housing, but yesterday in South Dublin, Fine Gael councillors voting to sell off 70% of publicly owned land to the private sector. In Dún Laoghaire, last night, our councillors put a motion opposing the sale of land that was designated for the last 10 years for traveller accommodation, up near Stillorgan, put a motion saying it should not be sold, also put a motion saying public land in George's Place in Dún Laoghaire should not be sold. Fine Gael councillors and Fianna Fáil councillors said we should sell it. We should sell it. Right? Selling off land that was designated for traveller accommodation to the private developers. So it's just spoof that you're going to deliver public and affordable housing. You're busy privatising and using the crisis to privatise, as an excuse to privatise public land to benefit your landlord friends and the vulture funds and the corporate landlords that you invited in here. And then, as if all of that isn't a big enough insult, you've done nothing about the tax loopholes that you created, which mean they will pay no tax on the rental income and the capital gains they're making. I mean, this really is a scandal, and I'm going to keep jumping up and down about it until somebody investigates it. For the last 3 years, I have been putting in questions asking how much tax is foregone to the Section 1110 tax relief that has been given to all the vulture funds and asset management corporate landlords that you brought in after 2012. We can't get an answer, Count Corla. Now, to me, that is a scandal. Billions in tax reliefs are going to these Irish REIT, to Kennedy Wilson, to Lone Star, and when you ask the Minister for Finance how much is it costing the state, they don't know. They don't know. They will not give an answer. It's unbelievable. But that is the money. If they were paying their taxes, that we could actually be investing in building the public and affordable housing. And by the way, I have to say a word about Fianna Fáil here on this, right? Fianna Fáil last week supported the motion of the Raise the Roof campaign, which called for an additional €1 billion minimum in investment in the direct construction of public and affordable housing on public land. In this budget, which you are now apparently going to allow pass, there is less than quarter of that. Less than quarter of it. Okay? So it's not even going to scratch the surface. You've already done a U-turn on the commitment that was made in front of the country last week. Now that is undemocratic. It is an absolutely unbelievable betrayal of the people who came out on the street last week, and far more importantly, an unbelievable betrayal of the people who are being engulfed by this social emergency, which is the housing crisis. It's shocking. Shocking, but not terribly surprising. In the area of health, okay? Yes, you plugged the overrun with additional funds from windfall receipts in the corporate tax area, and yes, you put an extra $1 billion into health, which at least is going some way towards addressing the crisis. And obviously I welcome the additional funding in the areas of mental health and so on. But Minister, there's a big problem with all this. Okay? The mental health budget, which we need additional funding in, first of all, it's less than what mental health reform asked for. It's still significantly lower a percentage of the health budget than is the average across Europe, 8% rather than the 12% that is needed. But the critical problem is that even if you allocate this money, if you can't get the staff in mental health services, if you can't get the nurses to work in the A&E units and in the hospitals, it's not going to make any difference. This is the problem. This is why we can't open the beds. This is why CAMHS is not functioning. Is because we can't get the staff to work in the health service because you won't pay them properly. You won't pay them. And your budget has done nothing to address that. That the nurses, do you know how much the average nurse is going to get, Count Corla, as a result of the taxation changes? When you strip out what was given back in the already committed which is miserable, right, isn't full pay restoration, isn't the abolition of FEMPI, isn't the re-establishment of pay equality, which was asked for, but in the actual budget, do you know how much the average nurse gets on a starting pay? 71 cents a week. 71 cents a week for the starting nurse. Wow, that's some incentive to stop the nurses leaving this country, who won't go and work in our health service because the wages are not sufficient to put a roof over their head, and in any event there's chaos in the public health system. That's going to change nothing. We are not going to get the level of recruitment, and you can say the same, by the way, about education. So we've got a real problem in recruiting people into the health service to create the capacity, because at the end of the day, the health service is mostly about human beings working in it, nurses and doctors. And if you don't have them, you can allocate the money and it doesn't make any difference. Right? So we've got to pay the nurses and the other healthcare workers to come back and work in the system, and you have not done that in this budget. Because you are still trying to exploit the financial emergency. And isn't it incredible, right? No emergency for housing, but you're still extending the emergency which allows you to slash the pay of public sector workers. The longest emergency legislation in the history of the state. And this is after the emergency was declared over, the financial emergency was declared over about
history of the world, perhaps.
Possibly the history of the world, indeed. Emergency legislation in an economy that is recording record growth rates, where you're boasting about the level of economic growth, where corporate profits have doubled since you came into power, from 77 billion to 144 billion, doubled in that period. So some people are doing extremely well in the Irish economy, Count Corla, but still it appears we need emergency legislation to keep the pay of public sector workers down. It's outrageous. But the problem is, not just is it unfair on those workers, but unless you address that inequality, that unfairness, you will not get the people to come back into particularly health or education and other key areas of the public service where we need them. And I'll give you a few other examples of the sort of miserable give back in this budget for ordinary working people. The single public servant on 25,000 will get an extra 51 cents. Whoopee. They'd be dancing in the aisles for that one, Minister. Wouldn't even get them a cup of coffee. A couple, one on an average industrial wage of 39,000, with a partner on 31,000, with 2 kids, struggling to pay the rent and childcare, will get a grand total of $3.50 per week. $3.50 per week, just about a cup of coffee. That's what you're giving back to working people. Then we have education, right? And this is a very serious one. You've increased the capitation grant by 5% to schools, but that still leaves it at €22 less than it was in 2008 when we started to cut. When it was €200. So even with this 5% increase, bringing it up to $178.50 per pupil, it's still less than the 200 it was back in 2008. So much for the recovery there for our school children. And for the desperately needed funding we need. And of course, as a consequence, no move on pupil-staff ratios in our desperately overcrowded schools, which are some of the most crowded schools, overcrowded schools in the Western world. But one of the biggest failures in this budget is in the area of third level education. And here it's really quite shocking. I mean, we've just had reports that our universities are tumbling again this year in the world rankings in universities. And you boast that you're going to have 15,000 more places in higher education and FEs, 3,500 additional places in undergrad education, sounds good, 18,500 extra people going into higher level education. Now you would think, Count Corla, wouldn't you, that that would require a bit of additional funding. Do you know how much additional funding is going into higher education? 1%. 1%. €13 million more than was allocated last year. and that is supposed to cover 18,500 additional students in third level education. So that means, in actuality, the amount of money going in per student into further education and third level education is going to drop and drop significantly. In a situation where already there is a crisis in investment and funding in third level education, and we are tumbling down the world rankings in universities and higher education. That's a serious problem. Right? And you don't have to be a socialist or a radical to understand what that means for the future capacity of this country to develop a sustainable economy, or indeed to withstand the inevitable shocks that we could face. Public transport and climate change. We get a report this week saying the climate crisis is even worse than the worst imaginings that we had previously. Ireland is one of the worst performers in trying to address climate change, not meeting its climate change targets, and is going to face hundreds of millions of euros in fines in the next few years because of its failure to meet its emission targets. And what do we get in the budget? Next to nothing. Next to nothing. One thing I will concede, and this is something we've been campaigning very strongly for the last 5 years, is some extra money in the area of forestry. And I'll acknowledge that. I'm glad that's happening. But I will say this, if it's not linked to breaking from the current industrial model of forestry and the monocultural model of the Sitka spruce, it won't deal with the environmental problems. In fact, it will cause as many environmental problems as it will solve. We need to link any additional funding in forestry to the development of native and broadleaf species, not to the monocultural industrial model, which is actually damaging the environment. The extra money is welcome, but we need a radical change in policy. But in the key area where you could actually do something to address emissions in this country, it is in the question of public transport. And there is nothing radical or changing there. In fact, Minister, even with the small bit of additional funding, and it's very, very small, there will be less subsidies going into the bus system than there was back in 2008 when the cuts started. Significantly less. And with all this Bus Connects plan, no serious investment in additional bus capacity, which just means, as we saw with the Bus Connects plan, robbing Peter to pay Paul. Taking bus routes out of one area in order to put them on more profitable routes in another area, but not actually increasing the capacity of the bus service, and nothing radical to encourage people to get out of their cars. In fact, more people will have to get into their cars if that Bus Connect plan goes ahead, because in certain areas they're going to lose those public service routes, particularly where the elderly and less mobile are. They'll have to get into cars to get to in our area to get to St Vincent's Hospital, because there will be no direct route to St Vincent's Hospital. They'll have to get on 2 buses and then walk a hell of a lot further than they originally would have got with the direct bus. So they're going to have to get into cars. But what you could have done, which we proposed, and is being done in other countries, in Estonia they have now done this, is make public transport free. Make public transport free. Which would cost €580 million, but by God, that would be a good investment, and that would cut CO2 emissions. And if you add to that, bring up public transport subsidies to EU levels, so we increase the bus fleet by about 500, or indeed even better, by about 1,000 buses, then you would have a public transport system that people would use and would make an actual difference to congestion and make an actual difference to CO2 emissions. Social welfare and dealing with the most vulnerable in our society. And again, it's a dismal picture. Back to school allowance, small increase, still would be less than it was in 2008. 10 years on, we're still giving less to poor and vulnerable and less well-off families who are crucified with the cost of sending kids back at this time of the year to school. The back to school allowance was always inadequate, but you're still going to be giving people less than they had in 2008 when all the cuts started. In the area of teenage poverty, Obviously, you've done nothing about the apartheid under 26 half rate for young job seekers, but also in terms of qualified child allowances. Very, very small increases, but the Vincentians and St Vincent de Paul and all of those groups saying it's not nearly enough to deal with child poverty and cover the cost for lower income families of bringing up children. Child benefit, still below 2008 levels by a very significant margin. One child, still €26 less than it was in 2008. Two children, still €52 less than it was in 2008. Three children, €115 less than it was in 2008. The income disregard for single parents, who are one of the most, if you like, disadvantaged groups in Irish society, the income disregard is still less than it was when the income disregard was introduced 21 years ago in 1997. So still no restoration in terms of the cuts that were visited on lone parents. I'll just conclude, Ceann Comhairle, on this. You see, you could say, well, that's a catalogue of this budget's failure to address the serious issues of a housing crisis, of a crumbling health service, of galloping away climate change, of a crisis in education, inequality and deprivation in our society. You might forgive all that if there wasn't the money to address it, if there just wasn't the money to go around. But you see, the dirty, great secret of the Irish economic story is that over the last 10 years, the profits and wealth of the rich in this country have gone through the stratosphere. Through the stratosphere. And that's not an exaggeration. Corporate profits in 2012 were $74 billion. Corporate profits today are $158 billion. More than double. But their effective corporate, tax rate is actually less. Than it was in 2008. Why? Because of a myriad of tax loopholes, deductions and allowances that you allow to the property speculators, to the corporate sector, amounting to, in the latest available figures, €87 billion in loopholes in a single year. So pre-tax profits are $158 billion, but then there's $87 billion of loopholes, bringing the taxable income down to taxable profits down to $71 million, letting these people away with murder. And Minister, this isn't just us saying this anymore. We've been saying it for 10 years. But the Controller and Auditor General confirmed this in his report in the last couple of weeks, where he actually identified $216 billion worth of allowances, deductions and losses forward that are being utilised by the corporate sector to avoid paying taxes. And he also pointed out that some of the richest people in Irish society, high net worth individuals, are paying less tax per year, 90 of them less tax per year, than the average industrial worker. It's shameful. It's absolutely shameful, but it's because of this myriad of deductions and loopholes that benefit the rich. Household wealth in Ireland, although the vast majority of people wouldn't know that, has gone to staggering levels. Unprecedented levels of wealth. $727 billion is now the total national household wealth in this country, which would amount to over $600,000 per household in the country. But do most households have anything even close to that? Of course they don't. Why not? Because even the government's own figures, the Department of Finance, show that 53% of all that wealth I've just described, is in the hands of less than 10% of the population. That's the problem. And your refusal to tax these people, to make them pay a fair share, just a fair share, to make them pay their 12.5% corporate tax rate, if you just did that, you'd raise an extra €7 billion. An extra 7 billion if you just enforce the 12.5% rate. You can't even give us a costing on the financial transaction tax. I've also asked that for the last 3 years. The Department of Finance will not tell us what the EU's proposal for a financial transaction tax would generate in Ireland. But what we do know is there's about 2 trillion of exchanges, if you like, worth going through the Irish Financial Services Centre. And we can't get a figure on what an FTT would generate. So that's what's going on. That's the dirty secret. While you fail to address the dire, shameful housing emergency, a crumbling health service, a crisis in education, runaway climate change, deep inequality in Irish society, you throw a few crumbs at that, and the rich and the property speculators and the REITs and the asset management companies run away with the cake. Run away with the cake, because you handed them the whole bakery. It's really, really shameful, and our society is going to pay a deep price. And the only answer is the sort of answer we saw on the streets last week. But one thing I can say as an optimistic note, that movement, which we saw born on the streets last week, is gearing up for the next phase of resistance against the shameful failure of this government to deal with the real problems faced by Irish society.